Can we get those lights brighter? Okay, so hi, I'm Tony Zervek, and I'm the Director of Persistent Universe for Star Citizen. I'll be doing the lead vocals tonight, and over here on my right, on the keyboard, is Jake Mealy, our economy designer from Austin.
Hi.
And we're going to be showing you something pretty interesting tonight, and I want to make sure to call out our guitar and bass players back in Montreal, Martin and Robert Lizy.
Yeah, that's right.
They spent a lot of time working with us over the last, 4, 5, 6 months, very, very intensely on what we're going to be revealing tonight. It's been a bit of a stealth project recently. We've actually shown it to very few people within Cloud Imperium because we wanted to get it to a level of maturity to where it was very easy for people to understand what the benefits of this new technology were going to be. And I'm going to give you a glimpse of it tonight, but you're going to need some background information to truly appreciate it, so bear with me for a bit and you'll see why we consider it a quantum leap. So, as everybody here obviously knows, Star Citizen is a very ambitious project. Our goal is to deliver a variety of incredibly detailed solar systems that behave in logical fashion and that then give you ample freedom to follow your interests, whatever they may be. Thus far, we've been focused entirely on a single system, Stanton, which includes 4 planets, 12 moons, 225 economic nodes, 44 trading outposts, 13 rest stops, and 50 asteroid fields. So yeah, it's really big. The point of this presentation then is to give you a better understanding of how, when the first one's taken so long, we're aiming to kick things into overdrive so that we can deliver new systems much more quickly. This involves, obviously, a lot of different areas: procedural generation of terrain, modular art sets, algorithmic detailing of buildings and interiors, and a lot of other stuff. For the purposes of this talk, though, I'm going to focus on what I call the dynamic content. So, what is dynamic content? Dynamic content responds to player and NPC actions in logical fashion. It's systemic. This means that the universe is in constant motion, which makes it a far more interesting place to explore. Most missions should, of course, be dynamic in nature. They should only be offered when there's an actual need for something. This might take the form of a factory that needs some aluminum to create a retail product, a criminal that needs to be brought to justice, or someone that needs a lift from one location to another. At their core, missions are services provided by one party for the benefit of another, and they are therefore one of the fundamental ways by which imbalances in the economy can be addressed. Likewise, economic nodes, which include things like refineries, factories, and retail shops, need to be dynamic since they must continually take into account the various market forces and adjust accordingly. When demand for something outstrips supply, whether it's iron ore, bullets, or ship repairs, you expect prices to rise. And conversely, when there's an excess of something, you expect that prices will fall. There's more to it, of course. Concepts like marginal demand and price discovery require a fair bit of math. But in the end, it's all about the constant search for equilibrium as production and consumption levels vary. I'll get around to explaining probability volumes in more detail in a bit, but suffice to say for now that they dictate what you encounter as you travel through a given area. As such, they should definitely be dynamic. So, for example, if a new field of asteroids rich in valuable commodities is discovered, you'd expect to find a lot of NPC miners in the area, but as the resources are gradually depleted, their numbers should start to fall off. Pirates should gravitate toward areas with a lot of value to plunder and recoil as the amount of security ticks up. So let's look into each of these areas in a bit more detail and see why we've struggled to set up a single solar system and at the same time get a precise understanding of what needs to happen so that we can start moving a lot faster. We'll start with the missions. A Star Citizen mission is fundamentally just a container for code and data, similar in concept to a class in any of a multitude of modern-day programming languages. Inputs can be passed into a mission from either the runtime environment or services to allow for customization. This allows designers to do things like, say, inject the type and quantity of cargo, whether the ship should be damaged or not, and where the ship should be heading, into a generic transport scenario so that we can reuse the same framework for a lot of different situations. Missions can have content tags embedded within themselves to denote their composition, whether they contain security, pirates, freighters, miners, asteroids, or some kind of a combination. Missions can also have thematic tags applied. These don't specify physical content, but rather detail the headline story behind the scenario that a designer created. So designers can differentiate between a straightforward pirate encounter versus one that includes an ambush. Once these descriptors have been assigned, the missions are injected into a database that other systems can access so that they can be instantiated and customized depending upon the situation. This, however, is where we start to run into some major problems. Designers have to explicitly link missions to various constructs within the game, an NPC mission giver, for example, or a probability volume covering the area around yellow. This is time-consuming and greatly complicates maintenance. If a content tag, like pirate, is split into subtags like pirate light and pirate heavy so that we can have more control over what we're aiming to instantiate, you have to go to every place you had assigned the original mission category and individually determine which of the new ones should be enabled. Worse, this isn't dynamic at all. Mission content is fixed to specific NPCs and locations, so there's no evolution. The universe is completely static. Another major problem is that we don't have sufficient context to properly customize the missions. At a macro level, the game doesn't really understand the concept of a route, much less what miners traversing that route should be carrying, or what condition they should be in, or which direction they should be if they're empty, heading towards a mine, or full, bringing the results of their efforts back to a refinery. This lack of context means that we can't exploit a mission's ability to have information injected into it for customization, and that means that you see a lot less diversity, despite requiring just as much work. The last problem, and it's a big one, is that there's no NPC regulation of the mission content. Missions are the basic units of work for the economy, and if someone doesn't do what needs to be done, then everything grinds to a halt. In a properly functioning system, NPCs need the ability to step up if players aren't going to, and the risk-reward justifies the effort, and do the work themselves. If a commodity can be purchased at one location and sold at another for a dramatic markup, and there isn't enough cost or risk involved in the transport to warrant the differential, NPCs should seize the opportunity and move the material themselves until the price starts to make sense. So let's talk about economic nodes now. An economic node is an entity within the game which might be represented via an actual storefront, a kiosk, a UI interface, or an NPC that possesses an item manifest detailing the items it wants to buy or sell, storage capacity, and a fair bit of data related to determining prices. This includes refineries that process ore, factories that produce goods, and retail stores where you buy finished products. Factory inputs aren't explicitly denoted, but are instead derived from the production formulae of whatever they manufacture. Prices, what economic nodes are willing to pay for their inputs, and what they want in order to sell, are determined algorithmically based upon the rate of change of their inventory versus the tangent of a pricing curve. This means that they're smart enough to, say, raise the price of what they're selling, even when their inventory is low, if they detect that they're being resupplied at a sufficient rate to get where they want to be in a reasonable amount of time. So clearly, there's some dynamism happening here, which is fantastic. Unfortunately, that's where the good news ends. As with missions, economic nodes don't have any real context in terms of supply and demand, and there's no systemic flow of goods throughout the economy. Why does a refinery want ore? Why is an NPC willing to buy some drugs from you? Where does the shop get the goods that it's selling? Right now, the answer to all these questions is the same. We fake it. Economic nodes conjure up their own supply and demand out of thin air. If a node is designated as wanting to purchase a particular item, for example, designers dictate a formula that describes how that inventory will be gradually burned off so that they want more. These products you deliver to a node then, they don't actually go anywhere. There's no real demand. This is impossible to balance because while production and consumption are fixed, the player count isn't. Sometimes 100 players are interacting with an economic node, and sometimes none. And I mention this because behind the scenes, at the economic level, all of the players, despite being on different servers, really are connected to one single system. A real economy is a tangled web of dependencies, and you can't expect logical results when its gears can completely seize up due to the action or inaction of players. What we really need then is NPC regulation of the system. For NPCs to purchase items when they need them, thus keeping the demand side logical, while stepping in to help with the supply when players don't and the risk-reward warrants it. This has ripple effects into other areas. If the demand for missiles spiked because there was a lot of combat, you'd expect that the commodities used to construct those missiles would start to rise in price. And you'd also expect to see more miners and freighters working to alleviate that shortage. If the price got high enough that those transports would be carrying a lot of value, so you'd expect piracy to increase, at which point you should start to see a lot more security patrols and requests for combat escorts. A simple change in demand then should be able to alter not only what you see as you travel throughout the system, but also the available missions. These kinds of knock-on effects, in fact, should happen regardless of whether any player is in an area, and that's a separate problem I'll talk about more when we get to probability volumes. So let's take a quick look at what it means to set up an economic node. As I mentioned, there are about 225 economic nodes within the Stanton system, and many of them deal with a lot of different items. Each of these items can specify its own production or consumption formula, along with a lot of other information, storage space, optimal inventory level, price offsets, and much more. This information can be archetyped, but of course the world's a lot more interesting if every economic node is a bit different, so there's still a lot of customization that winds up happening. So now let's take a look at the economic nodes around a typical planetary system. And finally, let's take a look at the economic nodes around the entire Stanton solar system. That's a tremendous amount of data to set up and maintain as we're routinely adding new items and changing prices. And the worst part is that it's all extremely rigid. There's no way to have an economic node increase how much of something it produces or consumes, because those things are attached to formulae that have no understanding of external events. So right now, designers try their best to brute force this stuff, to make it feel like it's a systemic world, even if it's not. If an area is configured to have a lot of pirates, they increase the price offsets and demand for goods at nearby nodes. If the number of pirates is subsequently decreased, or maybe more security is added to the area, then the nodes are updated to reflect that fact. It's a ton of work, and while this sort of hand tweaking does yield something that feels vaguely logical, if static, it's definitely not a real solution, and it doesn't even begin to address the major problems. Now we come to the last of the major areas for which I wanted to illustrate the problems that we currently face. So, what is a probability volume? A probability volume is an area of space that contains information detailing what you should see as you pass through the area. It's an optimization of sorts in that it allows us to achieve a desired effect, a certain number of pirates in an area, or a particular likelihood of encountering a freighter filled with iron ore, without having to burn a lot of computational horsepower simulating things when there are no players around to see it. This is accomplished via linking mission content tags to probability curves that span all or part of the expanse of the volume. So, for example, you can denote that security ships are commonplace near Port Olisar and gradually fall off over a couple hundred kilometers, whereas it's very rare to see pirates who would prefer to avoid security close to Port Olisar, but more likely to see them as you get farther away. There are quite a few different types of curves denoting, because until a player actually accepts one of these missions and heads to that location, there are a variety of probabilities. I think some of our notes got screwed up here. Anyway, so one of the more interesting types of curves is the spoofing curve, which allows missions to skirt the normal rules, requiring that they can only be created in the proximity of a player. And this is done so that an NPC can request that you travel to them to provide something they desire, in which case, obviously, we can't limit them to only existing in yours or another player's immediate proximity. This is how combat assist is currently handled, and we'll be adding some other things like NPC refuel and NPC passenger transport in the near future. The reason it's called spoofing is because we only keep a small stub active on the back end, which is way more efficient. We've got other types of curves. There are reinforcement curves that allow designers to dictate how quickly backup tends to arrive when you've been identified as a felon. And we also have the ability to modulate that time according to how far away you are from the place you were last spotted and how long ago that was. There are bounty hunter curves, which allow us to link to a probability, to your wanted level so that we can increase the encounter frequency when they'd actually be hunting you, and otherwise keep them very rare. Let's continue on, though, and get a better understanding of how exactly probability volumes works. Here we have an area of space that's marked up as having a certain probability of pirates and freighters, security, asteroids, and derelict ships. Now let's go ahead and activate all of that content. That's a lot of content to simulate when no one is around to see it. A lot of pathfinding NPCs, animations, vehicle physics, collision detection. Now let's go ahead and introduce a player and clear the board. Those pirates and freighters and everything else, they still exist, but only in a probabilistic state. As the player traverses through the volume, we roll the dice on the various curves and force the probabilities to make a choice. Does that content exist at that location or doesn't it? Here, the player gets a hit from the asteroid probability. So the mission database is then queried to find missions with the associated content tag, dynamic parameters injected, and the mission is instantiated. And now a bit later, the player trips the freighter probability and then eventually runs into a pirate. The key point here is that much of the world exists as a superposition of probabilities until a player gets sufficiently close that the wave functions collapse, at which point we instantiate them and start simulating the full-blown entities. One of the quirks with probability volumes is that they usually represent a variety of low-frequency events. Space is big after all, and even in a pretty heavily populated area, you shouldn't be running into other ships all that often. The problem is that the likelihood of multiple events happening simultaneously is a product of their probabilities, meaning that it's very unlikely you'd ever see two or more at the same time. So let's go ahead and see what this means in practice. Here's a player traversing a probability volume. He makes it through a good part of it before the freighter's probability curve determines that an encounter has occurred, at which point the probability volume queries the mission database with the freighter tag and instantiates a compatible mission. The player continues on, and shortly thereafter, the pirate's probability curve indicates a hit, which triggers another lookup into the mission database. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with this. In fact, it's a pretty accurate representation of what you'd realistically expect to see. Two rare events happening on their own schedule. The systemic behavior of the freighter and the pirate, even if spawned separately, would allow them to logically react to one another. So if they were spawned in close enough proximity, the pirate might even attack the freighter. The problem is that this approach lets the algorithms dictate too much of the experience, and if you're not careful, this can lead to the gameplay starting to feel very formulaic. What we really want is the ability for designers to craft more custom content and to then have a mechanism by which we can trigger it such that it all feels logical, if a bit lucky in the timing. Our slides seem to be stuck.
My slides are stuck. My microphone is dead.
Yeah, we seem to be having a couple technical problems.
Yeah, there it is. Hello. Oh. CitizenCon, am I right? CitizenCon, am I right? Yeah. All right. What do you think? We can just show them.
We can just do Q&A. We could still jump, but I'm sure they'll get this. I'm sure they'll get this resolved in a second. So I'd hate to skip ahead. Like I said, this is the medicine you'll have to take so that you can fully appreciate what we're going to get to in a few minutes. I know it's a little bit odd to spend the first 20 minutes talking about all the problems with the game and how they've made creating one solar system so incredibly difficult, but I do think it will help clarify the value of what we're going to be showing a little bit later.
Okay. I think we're good.
Okay, so we're back in live. So what we do instead of basically allowing the algorithms to entirely control what you see is we defer the activation for a short period of time and bend the probabilities of other things so that we're more likely to get a combination than would otherwise be the case. So they once again the player once again triggers the freighter's probability, but rather than, you already got it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're running a little bit ahead. But basically what you've seen here is the player hit the freighter's probability, held on to it We bent the probabilities to increase the likelihood of anything else being able to be attached. In this case, that involved the freighter. It involved the pirate, rather. So why does this matter? Think about a pirate and a freighter being created separately. It's going to take a good while for the pirate to close the distance with the freighter, disable it, park next to it, and board it. This means that you'd never come upon a situation where the freighter's already been disabled and the pirates are rampaging through the ship, so you'd better hurry if you want to save the crew. That's actually a really interesting scenario, though, one that'd be a lot of fun to experience. So while we're fine with the systemic functionality, driving things by default, we want to be able to bend things towards more interesting situations without it ever feeling too random every once in a while. The problem with probability volumes, then, all comes down to their construction. Each one, and there are lots of them, contains a litany of curves and associated data and is set up by hand, which is time-consuming and requires constant updating as other things change. One of the main reasons why they're so difficult to maintain is that many of the variables that a probability volume details should impact one another. More security in an area should, of course, impact the number of pirates, but because they're all handled independently, designers have to be very careful when modifying them. Mistakes are inevitably made, which results in a lot of sleuthing around to figure out what broke or is now poorly balanced and how to resolve it. The worst thing, though, is that they're static. If an area has a lot of pirates, it will always have a lot of pirates. There's nothing you or the NPC population can do to change that. Rewards won't vary based upon the level of threat in an area because the threat is always the same. A new commodity discovery won't cause miners to move in to exploit it and won't in turn attract pirates eager to prey on them. Demand for security patrols and escorts for that area won't increase in response to the pirates, and the pirate threat won't recede as a result. What we really need then is a way to dynamically derive the probability curves based upon what's happening, or rather should be happening when we manage to resolve all these problems I've been pointing out across the solar system. So I've called out a lot of very serious problems, things that require enormous amounts of bandwidth to set up and maintain and that still fail to deliver the experience we want. What we actually want is a dynamic, logical universe. We want the demand for goods and services to be the result of a legitimate economic need, and we must have sufficient runtime context so that we can customize these modular mission templates. NPCs must be able to contribute in helping to turn the gears of the economy from buying and selling goods to creating and accepting missions. The system needs to automatically balance itself so that we can focus on the high-level rules instead of the details. All of this, too, has to be incredibly computationally efficient, which means we need a more focused simulation engine, one that's only concerned with what we need to achieve the desired effect. If we're ever going to reach a point where we can deliver new solar systems in a reasonable amount of time, then we're going to need to make a quantum leap. So, what's the solution? Yeah, I'm supposed to flip.
We'll flip over to the other.
Yep, let's go ahead and flip the screens.
It's exciting, I really promise.
There we go.
Yeah, there it is.
So this is quantum, and I know what you're thinking, and I've seen this before. If the visuals look, particularly familiar, it's because we started with the solar system map that we released years ago. But this really is a totally different beast. The original star map referenced static data. There was nothing dynamic about it, but quantum is totally different. For starters, it has access to all of the back-end services and can pull whatever data it needs from them. Everything you see on the screen then, that's real-time data pulled from the game. So let's go ahead and take a quick tour of the system. Let's jump on over to Hurston. Actually, I'm not getting the screen over here. I'm going to go ahead and jump over with you. I can't see anything.
Just scoot on over. There it is. Hurston.
Yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and jump on over to everyone's favorite gas giant, Crusader. And in the background there, you can see Port Olisar. Let's go ahead and bring that up. Now, I mentioned that we're connected to all the real-time data. Let's go ahead and see what the players are up to. So, each of those red dots is a real player, thousands of them across well over 100 servers. Now, to be honest, we recorded this earlier mainly because we didn't know how many people would be playing the game while we were doing this show.
'Cause y'all are right here, right?
And I figured it would be totally anticlimactic to say, here are all the players, and 3 dots showed up. So let's go ahead and continue the tour of the solar system and jump on over to Daymar. And you can see a number of people affixed to the planet. Some of those obviously are going to be at outposts. Some of them are inevitably mining. Over there on the right, you can see the current player list. Let's go ahead and see what a couple players are up to. Just go ahead and highlight them so we can see where they're at. And let's go ahead and jump to Circo Worm and see where he's at. It looks like he's in Loreville.
Here he is. Hi, buddy.
And you can actually see some deaths down on the planet there. So obviously there's been some conflict there. And you actually see, let's go ahead and back out a little bit and find there's a contract to the right. You have access to missions, so you can see that Clipsos Norwang is requesting personal transport to Loreville, and he's willing to pay $4,500.
Good on you, buddy.
Let's go ahead and jump on over to Ariel, and we can get a view of those probability volumes that I was talking about earlier. And so what you're seeing here, as I mentioned, there are a variety of different types and lots of different content and thematic tags for all these things. So you can see everything from the default tags, you can see the security reinforcement tags, the bounty hunter tags, the spoofing tags. There are a number of these. We'll be adding more. In general, what it's doing is, as I mentioned, it's basically representing things in probabilistic state because it's too expensive for us to fully simulate them. Now let's go ahead and jump over to a shop. Let's check out the Hicks Research Station that's on Cellin. Yeah, we've got to go over to Crusader. And let's go ahead and open up that shop.
Oh, look, here's...
Yep, there's Outpost Correa, and you can see that there's a lot of death around there. And over on the right at the Hicks Research Station, you can see all the things that it buys and sells and what those prices have been doing over time. Now, I suspect I know what you're thinking at this point. This is all very cool, but it doesn't really solve any of the fundamental problems that I mentioned earlier, and that's totally true. So let's clear the board and get to that. So the primary reason for quantum's existence is to enable us to have one unified world where we can, simulate millions of NPCs and feed back into that all of the player actions into one unified whole. So there's really no difference. There are some optimized areas, the probability volumes that exist in between these two realities, but really this is the full-blown simulation. It takes into account all the player actions. So let's go ahead and start by bringing 1,000 quanta to life. You on the wrong one?
Yeah, that's fine.
So Jake here is cranking the number of quanta up to 1,000, and they're basically going to come streaming in from another system.
Flowing into the universe there.
These are simulated entities. And as I mentioned, the real significance of this is when you're talking about working out the vast multitude of details that we really need to allow this universe to evolve and feel dynamic, we don't actually need all of the incredibly high fidelity, super computationally expensive stuff that we would get if we were actually simulating these NPCs the traditional way on the server so that they look exactly like they would when you see them. These NPCs don't need to do animations. They don't need to do physics. They don't need to do collision detection. They don't need to do a whole slew of things that we couldn't afford to do. It'd be incredibly expensive to try. And in the end, even if we did it, it wouldn't make the end results any more accurate. So,
They also have personality traits too. Like each
Yep.
one has a little bit of something going on.
yeah, there are a number of different traits that we're modeling. We're still working out the exact configuration. One of them is ambition, and that specifies how far a quantum can push themselves relative to others, whether in crime or legitimate enterprise. Another one is intelligence, and that dictates what sort of things they can pursue and how well they can do something. Happiness is a measure of whether a quantum, the singular form of quanta, is miserable or content, and unhappy quanta want to change their situation, move to a new location, change occupations, and that sort of thing. Aggression controls the lengths to which a quantum will go to achieve their objective. A business-oriented quantum with a lot of aggression might push their workers harder, trading their happiness for more profit, and as a result have to deal with more turnover. And lastly, criminality, that determines the amount of criminal behavior that a quantum will consider. No criminality equates to a law-abiding quantum. Having a very little means that they might be willing to commit some minor crimes like smuggling or illegal mining. And a lot means that they're open to piracy and murder. They can have possessions, store up money, own a ship or property, have a home. Now, all of these quanta have basically come to rest within the system. And the reason for that is because there's nothing for them to do. There's no reason for them to get up off of the couch. So, let's jump to the next slide. We're going to add a little bit of interest to the system by adding an aluminum mine to Delamar. So we've now injected a mine onto Delamar, and yet you see the quanta still refuse to do anything, and that's because there's no economic reason for them to do it. There's nothing to do with the ore that they could go and extract. Let's go ahead and open up that card, though. So that card represents the mine on Delamar, and you can see a couple of stats towards the top, quantity and purity. And what these are is basically telling you how much of that material is in that mine, and purity is to some degree a measure of concentration. It effectively details how easy it is to extract it. There are a couple of parameters at the bottom that are temporary. Those will eventually be derived from those top two parameters, but for right now we can override it for some of the testing that we've been doing. So let's go ahead and jump to the next. So now we're going to go ahead and add an aluminum refinery to Crusader. And immediately you will see the quanta start springing to life. And what's happening is they've all figured out that refinery, it wants to build up a stockpile of aluminum. And in order to do that, it needs some raw aluminum ore, and thus it's willing to pay for it. And so the quanta are seizing upon that economic opportunity, heading out to Delamar, doing the work, extracting that ore, and taking it back to the refinery. And this will continue until it's full. So let's go ahead and open that card up again, and we can watch the refined aluminum ore gradually build up. You can also see the number of workers. A few of the quanta, so you see many of them actually acting as miners. There's also a number of them that are working in that refining factory. Refineries can't process this material without labor, and there's a formula that dictates how much labor is required in order to process this stuff. And so they have to hire a sufficient number of workers in order to actually execute this operation. And so this would continue for quite a while. Let's go ahead and speed up the simulation a bit. And go ahead and keep watching the aluminum inventory. That's finished, so they're now building up their raw ore to basically load up. And after that, the entire economy comes to a halt. The one refiner we've added has no more incentive to buy more. Its its storage houses are already full, and therefore it's not willing to buy. Since it's not willing to buy, the quanta have nothing to do. So what we're going to do now is add a factory. But before we do that, let's head on over to the power plant formula. And you can see here that building a power plant, just like refining ore, requires something. It requires 10 workers working for a duration of 60 ticks. And it also, notably, requires 2 units of refined aluminum ore in order to produce 1 power plant.
It's got to be more complicated than that, I promise. So.
Yes. Again, we're building up. So let's go ahead and add the factory to Hurston. You gotta slow down.
Oh, going too fast there. Slow on down.
And so once again, you see the economy spring to life. And so now you've actually got 2 different tiers going. The factory, let's go ahead and open up the factory. The factory, just like the refinery, needs workers in order to build these power plants. It also needs refined aluminum. So now you've got multiple things going on. The factory is willing to buy refined aluminum. Someone has to transport that aluminum from Crusader to Hurston. So some of the quanta are basically working, they're basically working as freighters to move that product from one location to another. Some of them were working at the factory on Hurston. Some of them were working at the refinery on Crusader. Some of them are heading back to Delamar to actually do more mining. So you've got an entire little, economic cycle going here. However, it's going to wind up coming to a dead end here. Let's go ahead and accelerate it again, just like what we saw before, because eventually the factory fills up all of its warehouses. It can't take any more. It therefore has no more, it has no more need for refined aluminum. That will eventually shut down the refinery, which will in turn eventually kill off the miners. And you can see there that the inventory is still building on the aluminum, which is why there's still some activity.
There's a lot, yeah. But as soon as it's done, it starts flatlining, so you see that the inventory is capped out.
Yep, and now they're almost done. The factory is basically got, it's got all it can handle. The refinery has all of all it can handle. Therefore, the entire loop, draws to close again. So let's add one more node. Let's add a shop that sells power plants to ArcCorp. Slow it down again. And so now the loop is a bit more complicated. The shop is it's a retail shop. It's looking to sell power plants. In order to do that, it needs to be able to buy them for one price, sell them for another. So it adds its markup on, and it, just like the factory that requires transport of the refined aluminum from Crusader to Hurston, it needs the power plants transported from the factory to it. And so if you notice, if the individual quanta, they'll actually have a little translucent circle around them if they're carrying goods. And so you can easily differentiate whether or not the ones that are moving, for example, from Hurston back to the mine are empty. They're going to load up on ore. And then when they're heading back to Delamar, and then from Delamar back to Crusader, they've actually all got ore. And so this loop will actually continue indefinitely. And the reason is because we've cheated something for tonight, and it sounds very similar to what I was basically saying was a bad idea earlier, which is the shop right now is a simple consumer. It's burning off that inventory. The difference here is that the solution to that is very simple in the context of quantum. And the reason is these quanta, the next step of what we'll be working on is they'll actually require ships. Ships require engines. And so all of a sudden there's a real demand for how many power plants do you need? How many ships do you need? It all follows those same logical equations. So let's go ahead and add a bit more economic complexity.
Actually, a slide.
So thus far we've shown a very basic economic loop. One commodity, one refinery, one factory, and one retail shop. The real world, of course, is far more complicated. You'll have lots of different commodities, refining and production nodes, retail shops, and of course players in quanta competing against one another for a limited supply of goods and services. It's this competition, this economic natural selection that ensures that things remain in balance, that a logical equilibrium is reached. Should have already gone to it. So, next. So, our current architecture basically has players connecting to a game server. And then we've got services behind the scenes that can feed information to these servers and receive information back in return. And so you can see here, we've got shop services and probability volume services and all of this sort of thing. The basic problem with this arrangement is that services don't have any knowledge of what NPCs are doing, or rather what they should be doing. So that shop service that controls the prices, it's got algorithms, but it has no real understanding. It doesn't understand that there are 10,000 NPCs that do or don't need this, or what pirates are doing, or any of that. We don't simulate at that high level anywhere within the game right now. You have servers that basically instantiate the stuff near you, and you have the services that can run these formula, and that's basically it. Now, they can implement these services, these algorithmic price calculations, but supply and demand only comes from players and hard-coded formulae. And it's the same for missions and PVs. The data is completely static and can't evolve. The number of servers, of course, as we've seen here, it varies depending upon how many players are in the game. So let's go ahead and add quantum. Quantum changes this in dramatic fashion. It gives us a place where we can efficiently simulate NPC behavior and then feeds that behavior to the game server so that players can experience it. Further, it allows player actions to be fed back into the simulation so that there's no meaningful difference between the real and simulated worlds. Quantum creates a complete loop. NPCs can be simulated in efficient fashion. And I actually meant to say that quantum feeds the services, which in turn feed the game servers. So let's go ahead and get back to the simulation. And what we're going to do now is alter the power plant formula. So let's add a bit of complexity by changing the production formula for power plants to require laranite.
We're gonna add some.
We need to change the production formula.
No, we gotta change we're gonna add laranite first.
Oh, right, yeah, okay. Yeah, we do want to add the new mine first. So we're going to add a laranite mine to Walla. And then we want to go ahead and add a refinery for this laranite. We'll add that to the Hurston L3. And now let's go ahead and adjust that power plant formula. And we're going to change the power plant formula. Right now, it requires 0 laranite. We're going to change that to 2. And what we're going to very quickly see here is that we're going to start getting some laranite flowing to the Hurston factory so that the power plants can continue to be created. Yep, and that's that loop of guys right there. That's what they're taking. Now, one of the important things here is that let's go ahead and look at the Hurston aluminum. Bring Hurston factory aluminum. Now, what wound up happening there is it was very low for a period of time, and that's because they were actually burning off that aluminum inventory as fast as they could get it. And the reason why you see that spike there in the aluminum inventory is because as soon as we altered the formula so that power plants now require laranite, they were still receiving from all these freighter transports. They still had aluminum coming in, but they could no longer produce power plants. So it stalled, and then all of a sudden they started stockpiling. And then when you see that the aluminum started falling, that's because finally they started receiving supplies of laranite, and they were able to resume the production process. And so all of a sudden, their aluminum started getting burned off at a natural rate. Yeah. So now we're going to add a bit more laranite out in the asteroid fields, and Jake's going to handle that via macro. And Now, let's go ahead and increase the supply of aluminum and see what happens. So we're going to add a few new mines. So let's add an aluminum mine to Cellin first. And let's add one to Aberdeen as well. And lastly, we're going to do Lyria. And if you remember, we already have an aluminum mine on Delamar. They're telling us we need to hurry up.
You jump ahead, I guess.
You guys want us to hurry up or keep going? All right, so it's like 400 to 1. Let's add a couple more aluminum refineries as well to the Crusader L4 and ArcCorp L1.
Crusader L4.
Yep, and ArcCorp L1.
Yep.
So now let's go ahead. We just added all of this new aluminum. So let's head back to that Hurston factory and see what aluminum prices are doing there. What's that factory having to pay for aluminum with all this new supply, these new mines, these new refineries? And there you see that the price is starting to fall off. Can you speed it up a little bit? Let's let you see what it does. And if you see, it continues to plummet. So those prices are pretty much falling off a cliff now from all that extra supply that's been brought on without us having to go back and rebalance anything. So let's go ahead and head on over to Cellin. And you can see that Cellin is in very close proximity to Crusader. So you've got an aluminum refinery and aluminum mining, yet there's very little activity. And the reason is because the aluminum at that mine is very difficult to extract. So let's go ahead and adjust the mining time on Cellin from 180 to 120.
There it is.
And what this, again, reflects is how difficult it is to extract from that particular location. And so you see, there now you see a few guys are actually willing to put in the amount of work necessary to extract it. Not all of them, it's still a lot of effort. And this comes back to every one of these guys having their own individual set of traits. So some of them were willing to endure, more risk, more, more effort, that sort of thing. So let's go ahead now and increase the laranite consumption.
Hurry up a little bit. You can jump ahead to the...
Let's just go with normal pace.
All right. There you go.
So let's make the laranite more difficult to work with and more rare and see what happens there. So we're going to adjust the global laranite refining time from 60 to 120.
We're adjusting the time on Walla to be...
We're going to do both. The global refining time, we want to take it to 60 to 120. And Walla's extraction time goes from 60 to 180.
That's right.
60 to 120.
No.
Laranite. So what we've just done is basically make it more time consuming, more difficult to refine it, and we've basically made it more difficult to pull it out of the ground. So let's go ahead and apply a macro also to reduce the default purity of laranite from 50 to 16%, which means that refineries are going to need more ore to produce the same amount of refined product. Reactive? And now let's go ahead and take a look at the laranite prices on the Hurston factory. So we just did 3 different things to make it considerably, more expensive for laranite to be utilized.
Speed up that time.
And Speed it up, and you can see that Laranite prices are going up, up. It looks like they're starting to skyrocket. This could be a complete economic disaster. If you notice, they're just going up, up, up. So what we're going to do now to bring that back into control is let's go adjust the power plant formula to compensate a bit. So let's adjust it from, instead of 2 Laranite, let's change it to 0.1. So we just reduced the amount of Laranite needed in the economy by 95%. And let's head back and check out the prices again. And what we should see here in a minute is Laranite should start to drop off pretty significantly. And there you go.
Crisis averted.
And this will continue to drop if we watch it. You always get a little bit of turbulence because you've already got contracts set up and stuff.
Right.
Go ahead and leave it in. I want to see it drop a little bit more.
We all want to see it, Tony.
So it's already down 40, 50%, and it'll keep falling. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add some additional factories. Delamar looks pretty dead. There isn't a lot of economic activity happening over there. So let's add a bit of life by adding a new power plant factory.
Yeah, I went over here too.
And yeah, let's add a Hurston L4 factory for power plants as well to create a little bit of competition for aluminum. And then let's head on over to Hurston factory, and let's check out their workers. You notice that their workers are falling off a cliff. What is happening? Well, we just opened up a new power plant factory, and they're getting offered better wages from another place. And so, and what are the wages on Hurston?
I'm gonna grab this guy.
Let's see what the wages that they were offering. I can't see it. So they were up at, is that 0.25?
Yeah, Delamar's offering like almost 3 times the wages of.
Yep, so there you see the differential, which is that factory is more desperate for workers, and so you see, let's look at basically the workers skyrocketed on Delamar and plummeted on Hurston. And eventually those wages, of course, stabilize. They find a point of equilibrium, which is a big point of all of this. So let's go ahead now and make some major changes. We're going to do this with a macro, and you can see where we currently stand on the slide.
There's like a bunch of stuff that we were supposed to be showing here. Absorb it quickly, everyone.
There we go. So we've added lots of aluminum, titanium, and degreasium. In the entries that you see on the screen marked system, all of the moons now have deposits. We've added a bit more Laranite, but it's still pretty rare. We've also added a lot of new refineries. We've added cooler and quantum drive recipes to most factories, and they require aluminum, Laranite, titanium, and degreasium. The demand for coolers and quantum drives has been introduced, and we've also increased the demand for power plants. And lastly, we've increased, you can see there at the bottom of the screen, the number of quanta from 1,000 to 2,000 so that we've got enough workers to keep the economy humming. Now, previously, we've seen pretty obvious cause and effect. At this point, though, the economy is starting to get pretty complicated. And we can look at a few graphs to just see what's going on with some of the prices to see this. And this is one of the most interesting things about a really complicated economy, which is these changes in quantities and prices, the purposeful movement of quanta, this dynamism, these are all opportunities that you're going to be able to exploit within the game, and they're in constant logical motion. So, let's hit the next one.
Be a shame if somebody came to steal from these people, huh?
Yep, we'll bring up the slide.
Oh, okay.
You gotta bring the slide. All right, so now we've introduced some pirates. Let's go ahead, and so you can see that there are 4 pirate kraken. There's the Nova Riders, Low Riders, Nine Tails, and Dusters. Pirates have to return to one of their bases in order to refuel, rearm. Let's go ahead. If you notice, they head to the areas of highest value. Let's go ahead and zoom in there. And you can see that those are missions being created by the NPCs, no different than players would. In other words, you see a lot of deaths on a route that's got a lot of value. And go ahead and hover over some of those contracts. These are contracts that are being thrown out by the NPCs on that route. What's happening is the NPCs are basically being, some of the freighters are being picked on by the pirates, the ship is being destroyed, and now that NPC has ejected and needs transport back to civilization. And so they're requesting that. And these are missions that would be fed back into the game that you'd see, and you could wind up accepting these. Let's go ahead and take a look at Hurston, the coolers and quantum drives.
Check this out. This is where they're operating out of, you guys. Right. Where do you want to go check out?
The Hurston. Let's look at what happened to the cooler and quantum drives.
Oh, yeah.
So since we've now got a lot of pirate activity on that route, we want to see what's happening to the cost of some of those goods.
For a cool $500,000 UEC, you can get yourself your own power plant.
Yeah, I can barely see that.
It's actually normal. Piracy is really terrible for economics, you guys. So,
yeah. So let's go ahead now.
You can really see it over at the coolers where it started at like a really reasonable thing. Like
yeah, that's pegged. It's the scale. So basically, they were down around 1,000, 2,000, and now they just absolutely skyrocketed in price because so many of the freighters moving, whether it's supplies or moving the finished product from one location to another, are now being intercepted. And these quanta, as I mentioned earlier, it's like they have various traits, and some of them are very risk averse, and they won't go down routes where there's a significant chance of death. And so to counteract some of this danger, let's go ahead and bring in someone to fight the pirates. So here comes some security. And what you'll notice is that security is drawn to areas of conflict where there's a lot of deaths and such. So they're going to wind up gravitating towards those areas where there's a lot of piracy. And there you can see them. Go ahead and over. Go speed it up a little bit, not 200. It's 200 is too fast. It's difficult to tell what's going on. And if you notice, by the way, the police will wind up patrolling an area, so they're in constant motion, whereas the pirates basically are enabling quantum interdiction fields. That's why they're basically picking a route on, they're picking a particular location on the route between, between two locations, and they're basically, lying in wait. And the security, which doesn't know exactly where they are, is scanning the area looking for them. And so what you notice here is that the pirate situation is starting to look a lot better now that security's shown up. And you would see this reflected over in the prices. And so what you have here is a perpetual game of cat and mouse, to where the pirates look for the areas where they can reap the largest rewards with the least amount of risk, and security is then drawn to them. And as soon as you get enough pushback from the system in terms of security, then the pirates look for more opportunistic pastures. And again, this is very much like what you would expect to see in any logical functioning system. So let's go ahead and turn on the grid. And what you're looking at here is one of the big problems I referred to earlier is how we wind up getting samplings of this, of how we generate probability volumes. And so what this is showing you is we can look at one of these high conflict areas, and it's basically tabulating exactly what's in that area. So you can see that there are 10 total quanta, 1 freighter, 11 pirates, 5 security. It also shows you the total value being transported. You know exactly what's going down that route. Let's take a look at a few other locations. Here you see the security and pirates are fairly even. 6 pirates, 7 security. A decent amount of value, 6 freighters. So there's actually an almost equivalent number of freighters, pirates, and security. This is the information that quantum, and it's a small piece of the whole, this is what it would wind up feeding periodically to the probability volume services, so that designers no longer need to go in and say, oh, well, we're going to hard code a certain amount of security, a certain amount of freighters, and it can never change. We ship it, that's all it's ever going to be. In this case, the simulation is running, it's constantly ebbing and flowing. And your actions over on the game side get factored into this result, just like any of the quanta in this simulation. So for years, we've had just the back-end services and the game servers, and the fundamental problem was that we didn't have a single area where the entire game could be simulated, where NPCs could request goods and services because they have a legitimate economic need and could vie with players to provide those things. We didn't have a way for this activity to determine what you see as you wander around the universe, thus eliminating the need to spend enormous sums of effort configuring vast quantities of static data that could never deliver the dynamic experience we really wanted. Quantum solves all of these issues. It also provides us with a lot more context, which means that concepts not previously understood, like how much risk there is in taking an item from point A to point B, can now be easily calculated. Information like this is vitally important to the price discovery machinery, and as I spoke about earlier, in a properly functioning economy, such things can and will generate a lot of ripples. We also get the information necessary to properly customize mission content, meaning we can deliver a lot more environmental and mission diversity without having to do any more work. I've covered a few of the large areas that quantum will impact, but the effects will be felt far wider. How many NPCs you see at a landing zone, for example, and what they're doing can now change over time. Manufacturing towns might boom and bust depending upon how much commerce is passing through them at any given moment. NPCs can grow and evolve separately from their interactions with players into powerful bosses, potentially, and you'll be able to witness their growth in lots of different ways. Criminal NPCs with a price on their head can move around the universe just like a player, making trying to catch them that much more fun. We've got a lot more work to do before quantum is ready for integration with the rest of the game, but it's one of the last big steps in setting us up for a completely dynamic and systemic universe. Thanks for listening.